Imagine you're running a country, right? And overnight, you are basically handed 2 billion eager young workers.
It's arguably the greatest economic gift in human history.
Exactly. I mean, you have this massive ocean of human energy just ready to build and invent and produce. But there is a catch. And it's a pretty terrifying one, honestly.
Right, because you only have a few decades to make all of them rich.
Yeah, because they're all going to get old at exactly the same time. And if you fail, you're left with this aging population, crumbling infrastructure, and a tax base that just completely collapses under the weight of national pensions.
It's the ultimate race against the clock.
It really is. And if you're listening to this, this isn't just some hypothetical scenario. This is the actual ticking time bomb sitting beneath the fastest growing economies on Earth right now. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And for the nations we're examining today, the stakes are, well, they're not just national, they're planetary. We're looking at a group that global institutions classify as lower middle income countries, or LMCs. Just to give you a sense of scale, we're talking about nations where the average citizen's income is somewhere between like $1,000 and $4,000 a year.
Right.
But those income brackets are just a snapshot. What we're really examining is a complete metamorphosis.
And to track that metamorphosis, we have an incredible stack of source material today. I mean, it's essentially this macro-level slide deck compiled from massive World Bank and global governance data sets.
It's a goldmine of data.
It is. And, I just have to say, looking at the visual design the researchers used for this presentation, it's striking.
Oh, absolutely. The aesthetic choices are very deliberate.
Yeah, they totally stripped away all the usual 3D graphics and neon colors you usually see in these corporate reports. It's all extremely minimalist, pure white backgrounds, like a strict FFFFFF hex code.
Right, very academic.
Yeah, and they use these really low saturation theme colors, like deep navy blues, a bit of gray blue, some sage green. The data ink ratio is incredibly high. It basically forces you to look at the raw reality of the numbers without any distractions.
Which is entirely necessary because the scope of the data is just overwhelming. I mean, we are looking at a multidimensional diagnostic of entire societies over the last 40 years.
Yeah.
We're tracking economic output, sure, but we're also tracking carbon footprints, literacy rates, hospital admissions, and corruption indices.
It's a holistic X-ray of these nations.
Exactly. We're trying to understand how they achieve this exponential growth and, honestly, more importantly, what invisible walls they're about to crash into.
Right. So let's start with the sheer scale of the wealth creation, because the first graph in this data stack, it's this double-line chart showing GDP and per capita income.
And they just use these really simple two-dimensional upward arrows to highlight the trend.
Yeah, and it literally looks like a plane taking off. If you go back a few decades, the collective gross domestic product of these LMCs adjusted for inflation, so we're comparing apples to apples, was hovering around $443 billion.
Which is a substantial amount of money, sure. But on a global scale...
It's a blip.
Right. It kept them on the extreme periphery of the global economy.
But then, as you follow the timeline toward the year 2000, you hit this massive inflection point. The designers actually drew a single, thin, monochromatic circle right around that specific data point on the chart.
The acceleration point.
Yeah, that line doesn't just trend upward, it goes nearly vertical. That $440-some billion skyrockets to over $7.56 trillion.
Trillion. With a T.
Yeah. And to put that in human terms for you listening, the data also tracks the gross national income per person, using the Atlas method to smooth out wild currency swings. The historical baseline for these citizens was about $135 a year. Let that sink in. $135 for an entire year of existence.
Which means living completely outside the formal economy.
Yeah.
That's surviving on subsistence farming, where, a single bad harvest basically means starvation.
Right. And today, that average has surged past $2,566.
Now, from the perspective of a high-income nation, $2,500 annually still represents severe economic restriction.
Oh, absolutely. You're not buying luxury cars with that.
No, but the rate of change is what dictates the future here. Billions of people have transitioned from sheer day-to-day survival into the beginnings of an actual consumer class.
Yeah, but you know what? The most vital piece of data on this chart isn't even the income. It's the gross domestic savings rate.
Yes, the capital reservoir.
Right. This stood out to me immediately. The next page has this combo area and bar chart, and it shows this dramatic leap in the data where the collective domestic savings rate of these countries climbs up and just forms this incredibly stable plateau.
They actually marked it with a horizontal dashed line on the chart.
Yeah, right at about 25.6% of their entire GDP. But I have a major question about this.
Go for it.
If your population is still only making a couple $1,000s a year, forced national saving of over a quarter of your economic output seems, well, brutal. I mean, isn't that essentially starving the present to feed the future?
It is.
Like, how does a government justify stockpiling wealth when people still need, better food and basic housing today?
That is the agonizing political and economic trade-off at the heart of developing economies. It is painful in the short term. However, history has repeatedly punished nations that fail to make that sacrifice.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you want to build a modern industrial state, which means pouring concrete for 6-lane highways, wiring thousands of miles of fiber optics, and building deep-water ports, you need a colossal amount of capital.
Right. Millions and millions of dollars.
Billions, actually. And if you don't have domestic savings, your only option is to borrow US dollars or euros from foreign lenders.
Which opens you up to those devastating currency crises, like we saw in the late 90s with the Asian financial crisis.
Precisely. If your national currency suddenly depreciates against the dollar, your foreign debt instantly doubles overnight and your entire economy collapses.
Wow.
These LMCs learn that lesson the hard way. That 25% savings rate provides a domestic capital reservoir. I like to think of a country's economy as a valley. Income from exports is a river flowing through it.
Okay, I'm with you.
If you don't build a dam, the water flows right out. It might give you a brief season of prosperity, but when a global drought hits, you have nothing left.
So the savings rate is the dam.
The savings rate is the dam. It pools the capital locally. It means a nation's own domestic banks have the massive leverage required to fund a new hydroelectric plant or a rail network.
And they're funding it in their own local currency.
Exactly. They are building the physical architecture of tomorrow using their own retained energy rather than, mortgaging their future to foreign bondholders.
I mean, it's basically the macro equivalent of an individual choosing to live in a smaller apartment and driving a beat-up car for a decade just so they can funnel a quarter of their paycheck into starting their own business.
It's a great analogy.
It hurts today, but it ensures you actually own the factory tomorrow instead of just, working in it.
Right.
But having a giant pool of capital sitting in a bank doesn't automatically generate wealth. That capital has to be deployed, and it has to be deployed by human labor. Which brings us to this massive shift in what the people in these countries actually do all day.
The structural transformation of their economies.
Yeah. And the source data uses this really stark, 100% stacked bar chart to visualize this. The visual compression of the agricultural sector over time is just profound.
It really is. Historically, these were completely agrarian societies. Over 42% of their entire economic value was generated simply by growing food and extracting raw materials.
Which, that has a notoriously low ceiling for productivity, right?
Exactly. You can introduce better fertilizer or a new tractor, but a hectare of land will only ever yield a certain maximum amount of wheat. You cannot achieve exponential trillion-dollar GDP growth through farming alone.
Right, and the data totally reflects that limitation. We see this relentless, steady drop in agriculture's share of GDP, shrinking way down into the 15 to 20% range.
Now, it's important to clarify here. The absolute amount of food produced didn't necessarily fall.
They just got better at growing it.
Right, they became more efficient.
Yeah.
What changed is that the rest of the economy exploded around that agricultural baseline.
And the designers put a big right-facing arrow on the chart to emphasize this. The primary engine of that explosion was the service sector.
Yes. The service sector became the dominant force for job creation and added value.
And this connects directly to a massive deepening in international trade. There's this line chart on page 5 showing trade as a percentage of GDP. And for decades, it hovered in the low 20% range. These nations were relatively insular. They were basically trading mostly with immediate geographical neighbors. But then The line just climbs aggressively.
It peaks at around 65%.
Yeah, and there's a neat little circle drawn around that peak with a note pointing out that it hit that high right before the 2008 global financial crisis. And today it sort of oscillates around a new normal of about 54%.
They essentially bound themselves to the global supply chain. They stopped producing just for domestic survival and started providing goods and services for the entire planet.
Right.
But the composition of those exports reveals a profound mutation in the traditional path of economic development.
How so?
Well, the classic Industrial Revolution model, the path taken by Britain, the U.S., and later Japan and China, it involves moving peasants off the farm and into heavy polluting manufacturing. Textile mills, then steel plants, then automobile factories.
But the data here highlights something totally different. I mean, yes, manufacturing grew, but the true outlier is high-tech exports, which broke the $100 billion mark.
Right.
And even more critical is the explosion of information and communication technology, or ICT service exports.
This is the leapfrogging effect.
Yeah, in certain LMC regions, ICT accounts for upwards of 30 to 35% of all service exports. They are basically attempting to bypass the heavy soot-covered factory phase and jump directly into a digital knowledge-based economy.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But it also introduces massive risks.
Right. I actually want to challenge the long-term stability of that leapfrogging strategy because, look, it sounds fantastic on paper. Clean office parks instead of smog-choked steel mills.
Absolutely.
But historically, heavy manufacturing is what built the middle class in the West. Factory workers were in one physical location, they unionized, they demanded collective bargaining, they pushed up wages, and they created this robust domestic consumer base.
That's the traditional mechanism, yes.
So if a developing country skips the factory phase and goes straight to building like call centers and IT back-end hubs that rely entirely on outsourced contracts from foreign tech giants, aren't they just building a house on sand?
That is the core vulnerability of the service export model. You've hit the nail on the head. It introduces an extreme level of macroeconomic fragility.
Because it's too easy to move.
Exactly. A steel mill is bolted to the earth. It is incredibly difficult and expensive for a multinational corporation to pack up a physical manufacturing plant and move it to another country just to save a few cents on hourly wages.
But digital services are completely frictionless.
Instantly movable. A call center can be moved to a different continent with a single email. If labor costs in one LMC rise even slightly, or if, say, a global recession forces Western tech companies to slash their outsourcing budgets, those contracts vanish overnight.
So that 54% trade integration we mentioned earlier.
It's a double-edged sword. It drives rapid growth when the global economy is booming, but it means that when high-income nations catch a cold, LMCs risk coming down with pneumonia.
That is such a vivid way to put it. And, you know, this connects so intimately to the daily life of anyone listening to this deep dive right now.
How so?
Just think about your digital footprint over the last week. When you interacted with customer support for an online purchase, or when your company's back-end servers underwent routine maintenance overnight, or even when a healthcare platform processed your insurance claim data.
Right.
There is an overwhelming probability that the human labor powering those invisible frictionless services was located in a lower middle income country. The cheapness and efficiency of the modern digital world we all enjoy are entirely subsidized by this specific structural shift in global labor.
And the sheer volume of labor available to provide those services is just unprecedented, which leads us to the demographic realities underlying every single chart in this slide deck.
Yeah, the 2 billion workers. Let's look at the population breakdown on page 6. The data separates the demographics into cohorts using this combined infographic style. And the dominant feature is the 15 to 64 age group.
The prime working age population.
Right. The designers actually circled this peak on the chart. It's a towering peak that exceeds 2 billion individuals.
This phenomena is known as the demographic dividend. It's a historical window that literally opens only once in a nation's life cycle.
Just once.
Just once. It occurs when birth rates begin to fall rapidly. So that means there are fewer dependent children requiring intensive resources for pediatric care and primary schooling.
Okay.
But simultaneously, because the nation hasn't yet achieved the extreme longevity of high-income countries, there are relatively few elderly dependents requiring pensions and geriatric care.
Oh, I see. So you end up with a society that is almost entirely composed of energetic, productive adults.
Exactly. It is a massive labor supply shock. You have this overwhelming surplus of human energy available to build the infrastructure, staff the factories, code the software.
And they don't have as many dependents draining their income.
Right. During this window, families have fewer mouths to feed, which allows them to save more money. And that directly feeds back into that 25% domestic savings reservoir we discussed earlier.
The dam gets fuller.
The demographic dividend is the literal fuel of exponential GDP growth.
Think of a startup company that decides to hire an entire cohort of ambitious 22-year-olds. They have no mortgages, no kids, no bad joints. They can work 80-hour weeks, sleep under their desks, and push the company's valuation into the stratosphere.
That's a great way to visualize it.
For a decade, productivity is off the charts. But you can't freeze time. Eventually, those 22-year-olds turn 35. They want families, they want work-life balance, and eventually they will hit 65 and demand a retirement package.
And that is the ticking clock hidden in the margins of the demographic data. While that peak of 2 billion workers commands our attention, you have to look really closely at the trailing edge of the graph.
The smaller chart on the right side.
Yes, the over 65 population. Historically, the elderly constituted about 3.3% of the population in these LMCs. A tiny fraction.
But the line is creeping upward. It has now crossed the 5.9% threshold.
Now, 6% doesn't immediately sound like a systemic crisis.
No, honestly, it sounds pretty manageable.
In isolation, it is. But demography is the most predictable science in economics. That 6% is the vanguard of a tidal wave. Those 2 billion prime-age workers are aging every single day.
So the ratio is going to flip.
Massively. The dependency ratio, the mathematical balance between those who are producing wealth and those who are consuming it without producing, is going to invert.
And when it flips, the economic burden shifts completely.
Yes. If these nations do not firmly establish themselves as high-income, high-productivity economies before they become old societies, they will be caught in an inescapable trap.
Because they won't have the tax base.
Exactly. They will lack the tax base to fund the healthcare and pensions of 500 million retired citizens. They have a narrow window of maybe 2 to 3 decades to maximize the output of this current workforce.
Man. But maximizing output relies on an incredibly basic assumption, doesn't it? I mean, that these workers are physically healthy enough to clock in every day. A billion-strong workforce is totally useless if they're chronically ill.
Absolutely.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, visceral sections of the data stack, the health data on pages 7 and 8. It's this paradox of human health.
It represents both a monumental triumph of modern public policy and a looming fiscal catastrophe.
Let's acknowledge the triumph first. The researchers visualized this with a mirrored bar chart. On the left axis, going up, they track total life expectancy at birth. In the historical baseline for these nations, average life expectancy was a grim 45.8 years.
It is genuinely hard to conceptualize a society where the average life ends before the age of 50. It dictates every single decision a society makes.
Yeah, but look at the trajectory. That number has soared to nearly 69.6 years. They have practically added a quarter century to the average human lifespan in just a few decades.
That's incredible.
And correlated with this is the right axis, pointing down, with a huge bold arrow marking the plummeting of infant mortality rates. They fell from 84.7 deaths per 1,000 live births down to the low 30s.
Millions of children who previously would have succumbed to preventable causes are now surviving into adulthood.
The psychological impact of that survival rate on a nation's economy, I mean, it cannot be overstated. If you're a parent and the statistical reality is that you might lose half your children before they reach age 5, your economic strategy is simply to have as many children as possible as an insurance policy for your old age.
Right, because you can't afford to invest deeply in any single child's education if their survival isn't guaranteed.
Exactly. But once you expect your children to actually survive, everything changes. You have fewer kids, you invest heavily in their schooling, and you plan for a future that you actually believe will exist. It changes the entire architecture of national planning.
It does.
Yeah.
But here we arrive at the paradox.
The disease shift.
Right. What happened to a healthcare system when people stop dying in childhood? Well, they live long enough to die of something much more complicated.
The data visualizes this through a really stark 2-part pie chart comparing causes of death.
Yes, and it reveals a fundamental epidemiological transition. In the past, communicable diseases, maternal and neonatal complications, and nutritional deficits accounted for roughly 49.6% of all deaths.
We're talking about like malaria, cholera, tuberculosis, basic malnutrition.
Exactly those acute crises. Today, thanks to vaccines, clean water initiatives, and antibiotics, deaths from those causes have dropped to 29.6%. It is a stunning victory for public health.
Whoa.
But as the lifespan extends to 70 years, deaths from non-communicable diseases, or NCDs, which they highlight in bold text on the chart, have surged.
These are things like heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and cancer.
Right. And their share of total mortality has jumped from 42% to over 61.4%.
Let's break down the sheer economic weight of that transition for a second. Why is the shift from fighting an infectious disease to fighting a chronic disease such a devastating blow to a developing economy?
It comes down to the fundamental design and capital requirements of medical infrastructure. Historically, public health in these LMCs was built around acute, episodic interventions.
Like digging a well.
You dig a well for clean water. You run a massive one-time polio vaccination campaign in a rural village. You stock a local clinic with cheap anti-malarial pills and basic antibiotics.
Those are pretty cheap to execute at scale.
Extremely cost-effective. You administer the treatment, the patient survives, and the interaction with the healthcare system is over.
But you cannot manage diabetes with a single cheap pill.
No, you cannot. NCDs require continuous, lifelong medical management. If a patient develops diabetes or hypertension, they need to see a specialist regularly for decades. They need a continuous, reliable cold chain to transport and store insulin.
And God forbid it gets worse.
Exactly. If they develop kidney failure, they need access to dialysis machines 3 times a week. If they get cancer, they need complex oncology wards, radiation therapy, incredibly expensive pharmaceuticals. Managing chronic disease over a 20-year horizon requires exponential amounts of capital compared to curing a bout of pneumonia.
I really want you, the listener, to think about the hospital systems in your own city right now. Think about the MRI wings, the cardiac intensive care units, the sheer staggering daily cost of keeping a modern medical center operational.
It's immense.
Now, imagine trying to pivot an entire developing nation's healthcare system, a system originally designed to basically hand out antibiotics and mosquito nets, into a system capable of managing millions of complex cases of heart disease and cancer.
Almost overnight.
Yes, and you have to do it while still maintaining that 25% national savings rate we talked about.
It acts as a massive drag on economic momentum. If an LMC cannot manage this epidemiological transition, 2 things happen. First, working-age adults are sidelined by poorly managed chronic conditions, which totally neutralizes the demographic dividend.
And the second thing?
The out-of-pocket costs for families trying to treat a relative's cancer or kidney failure will completely bankrupt them. It destroys that domestic savings reservoir.
So to maintain the economic engine, they have to keep these 2 billion workers not just alive, but continuously healthy. But, a healthy body is only the baseline requirement.
You're right.
If a country is trying to transition away from subsistence farming and low-skill garment manufacturing and leapfrog into those ICT services and high-tech exports we mentioned, muscle isn't enough. They need a highly trained, highly educated workforce.
Which brings us to the human capital data on pages 9 and 10. The slide deck presents this through a series of step charts tracking educational attainment. And initially, the data looks incredibly positive.
Oh, yeah. We see the near-total eradication of extreme youth illiteracy. The overall youth literacy rate for those aged 15 to 24 has climbed steadily. But the truly revolutionary data point, the one they circled with a dashed line on the chart, is female youth literacy.
The jump is staggering. It goes from a historical baseline of around 42% up to over 90.4%.
We are talking about entire generations of women who were completely locked out of written communication, suddenly entering the literate world.
And primary school completion rates follow the exact same trajectory, moving from 70.9% to nearly 88%.
Getting the vast majority of your youth through primary school and ensuring they can read is basically the non-negotiable prerequisite for economic development, really.
Absolutely. But it is only step 1. You cannot staff a digital economy or build an endogenous tech sector with citizens who only have a 5th grade reading level. To escape the gravity of low-wage labor, a country needs millions of engineers, logistics managers, data scientists, healthcare administrators.
And the data shows these countries recognize that. On page 10, there's this growth curve for tertiary education, and it has a really sharp upward arrow indicating the last 10 years.
Higher education. Universities, colleges, advanced vocational training.
Exactly. Enrollment expanded rapidly from single digits to nearly 27.9%. Over a quarter of the young adult population is now accessing higher education. They are rapidly building their intellectual infrastructure.
However, this is where we encounter one of the most frustrating, paradoxical, and economically inefficient data points in the entire source material.
Oh, the invisible gender gap, page 11.
Yes. The researchers present a scatter plot comparing male and female labor force participation, and they specifically draw a horizontal line between the dots to highlight the gap.
And it's a huge gap.
Keep in mind what we just discussed.
Yeah.
These nations have achieved near parity in basic education, and women are entering tertiary education at unprecedented, historically high rates. They've accumulated massive amounts of human capital. Yet, when you look at the labor market data, the ratio of female to male labor force participation is totally frozen. It has stagnated at roughly 50% for decades. The gap is not closing.
Let me push on this because from a purely cold macroeconomic perspective, this is absolute madness.
It really is.
You are taking a massive chunk of your hard-earned GDP money from that precious savings reservoir, and you are spending it to educate millions of young women. You bring them to absolute parity with men in terms of skills and potential, and then they just sit out of the formal economy. Why? What is the mechanism keeping them out?
Economists refer to this massive missed opportunity as the unreleased gender dividend. Now, the quantitative data in the World Bank sets doesn't explicitly measure cultural vibes, but it points a glaring spotlight on the structural realities of these societies. Why aren't educated women working? Well, it's a combination of traditional cultural norms that stigmatize women in the workplace, institutional barriers that legally or practically favor hiring men, and most crucially, the crushing weight of the invisible care economy.
The unpaid labor. The chart mentions that a massive amount of women's time is taken up by unpaid domestic and care work.
Exactly. Remember that growing 6% of elderly citizens we discussed. Who was caring for them? Remember the children who are now surviving infancy. Who is raising them? Who is maintaining the household?
In almost all of these LMCs, the entirety of that physical and emotional labor falls exclusively on women. There's no state-sponsored elder care or universally subsidized childcare.
Right. So an LMC produces a brilliant female software engineer. She gets her degree funded by the state or her family. But upon graduation, the societal expectation or the sheer lack of childcare infrastructure dictates that she must stay home to care for her aging in-laws and raise children.
Her immense educational capital is economically neutralized. I mean, she is performing vital work, absolutely, but it is unpaid and generates no formal economic output.
It is arguably the single largest economic efficiency loss in the developing world today, to use a mechanical analogy. These countries are paying a fortune to refine high-grade rocket fuel, and then they are deliberately leaving half of that fuel sitting on the launch pad while complaining that the rocket isn't flying fast enough.
Wow.
If an LMC wants to double its economic growth rate, the most direct, mathematically sound policy is to dismantle the barriers preventing half of its population from participating in the formal labor market.
It is intensely frustrating to look at the data and realize the solution is right there, just blocked by cultural inertia. But, let's shift our perspective from who is doing the work to where the work is actually being done.
Our physical geography.
Yeah, because you can't have an industrial revolution or a digital services boom if your population is spread out evenly across thousands of rural farming villages.
The physical map of these nations is transforming just as violently as their economies.
Yeah.
On page 12, we have a scatter bubble chart showing a massive wave of urbanization.
The urban populations in LMCs are growing at staggering annual rates, frequently hitting between 2.2 and 4.5% growth per year.
Just think about the logistics of that. A 4.5% annual growth rate in a city of 5 million people means adding over 200,000 new residents every single year.
You literally have to build the equivalent of an entire new mid-sized city, housing, plumbing, roads, schools every 12 months just to keep your head above water.
And along with the migration of people comes the desperate race to scale infrastructure. The chart shows electricity access jumping from historical lows of 71% to over 92% coverage in urban areas. This massive shift of humanity into concrete density is driven by the economics of agglomeration.
Agglomeration. It's a dense academic term, but the underlying concept is actually incredibly intuitive. It basically means that putting things close together makes them cheaper, faster, and smarter.
It is the spatial reality of economics. It is exponentially cheaper to wire a single high-rise apartment building containing 500 units for electricity, plumbing, and fiber optic internet than it is to wire 500 individual farmhouses scattered across a rural province.
That makes total sense.
But agglomeration goes beyond just cheap infrastructure. When you pack millions of people into a city, you create deep, highly specialized labor markets. You make mass public transit economically viable. And you foster the kind of localized, spontaneous innovation that only happens when different businesses, universities, and industries are physically pressed up against each other.
Cities are the engines of wealth creation.
They are.
But the slide deck also forces us to look at the exhaust pipe of that engine. Page 13 is styled almost like a red warning siren. They used a dark red tint on the line chart, with a big exclamation mark emphasizing the data point.
The ecological bill for this exponential growth is coming due, and it is terrifying. The data isolates per capita carbon dioxide emissions. If we look purely at the carbon pumped out by industry, transportation, and power generation, leaving aside complex factors like land use, the emissions have skyrocketed.
They went from 0.46 metric tons per person to 1.66 tons.
In many regions, the carbon footprint has essentially tripled or quadrupled.
And we aren't just talking about invisible greenhouse gases slowly warming the global climate, right?
No.
The data specifically highlights extremely high levels of PM2.5 exposure.
Yes.
For those unfamiliar, PM2.5 refers to fine particulate matter. That is soot, that is ash, that is the thick, acrid smog hanging over cities like Delhi, Jakarta, or Cairo. That is the air you breathe, visibly shortening your life expectancy and causing rampant respiratory disease.
The brutal, undeniable reality hidden in that $7.5 trillion GDP number we celebrated earlier is this. The economic leap of the LMCs has been overwhelmingly subsidized by the cheapest, dirtiest energy source available, coal. Their wealth was built by burning carbon. And now, the carrying capacity of their local environments is being pushed to its absolute biological limits. They're literally choking on their own growth.
Think about your own consumption habits for a second. When you go out on Black Friday and buy an incredibly cheap, massive flat-screen TV, or you order a dozen plastic toys online for next-day delivery, the carbon emitted to manufacture those cheap goods didn't magically disappear.
No, it didn't.
It is trapped in the skies over the LMCs. The cheapness of goods in the West is directly subsidized by the lungs of the workers in the developing world.
Which leads us right into one of the most contentious geopolitical debates of our time. The deeply unequal burden of the global green transition.
Oh, this is a point of massive international friction.
As an impartial observer of the data, the tension is obvious.
Yeah. High-income countries, the U.S., the U.K., Germany, industrialized over the last 150 years by burning cheap coal and oil with absolute impunity. They filled the atmosphere with carbon, built their immense wealth, paved their roads, established their universities. And now they are turning around to the LMCs and saying, hey, climate change is a global crisis. You can't build coal plants. You need to transition to wind turbines, solar grids, and green hydrogen.
Right, and from a purely scientific standpoint, the high-income nations are correct. If the LMCs pollute their way to prosperity using the 20th century Western playbook, the planet's climate will collapse. The math is unforgiving.
But from an economic standpoint, it is devastatingly unfair. Green technology, while getting cheaper, still requires massive upfront capital. High-income nations are essentially demanding that LMCs adopt expensive, cutting-edge, low-carbon energy systems, while those same LMCs are still just trying to guarantee reliable, 24/7 electricity to their hospitals and schools.
It's often framed as the ultimate hypocrisy. Do as we say, not as we did. But regardless of the fairness debate, the LMCs have no choice but to solve the problem. They cannot rely on the old polluting model because global supply chains are increasingly demanding green compliance. And honestly, more pressingly, their own citizens are demanding clean air.
But transitioning to a green economy while simultaneously trying to manage an aging population, a chronic disease epidemic, and an underutilized female workforce, that requires an incredibly high level of governmental competence.
Which brings us to the final and arguably most intractable section of our data, page 14.
The soft bottlenecks. Up until this point in the deep dive, we have been talking about hard numbers. Tons of carbon emitted, percentages of GDP saved, years of life expectancy gained. But the researchers also attempt to measure the invisible architecture of a society, the quality of its governance.
We're looking at specific World Bank governance indicators, primarily control of corruption and regulatory quality.
And the visual contrast with the rest of the data is jarring. They use these really subdued, low-key, gray bar charts to display this.
Because while the charts for GDP and literacy look like rockets taking off, the charts for governance are basically flatlining. In a standard matrix that ranges from -2.5 to +2.5, the majority of these LMCs are persistently trapped in the negative percentiles.
They are barely moving. Let's define what these metrics actually mean in the real world. Control of corruption isn't just about, like, a shadowy figure handing a briefcase of cash to a border guard, is it?
No, it measures something far more systemic. It aggregates data from citizens, local businesses, and international NGOs to determine the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain.
Okay.
This exists on a spectrum. At the lower end, you have petty corruption. A citizen having to pay a bribe just to get a driver's license, or a small business owner paying off an inspector to keep their shop open.
The day-to-day friction.
Exactly. But at the higher end, you have grand corruption, where powerful elites completely capture the state apparatus. They steer massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure contracts to their cronies, or they siphon off national resources directly into offshore bank accounts.
But what about regulatory quality?
That metric evaluates the government's ability to formulate and implement sound policies that actually promote private sector growth. Are the laws clear and predictable? Are the courts fair and impartial?
So if an entrepreneur invents a new piece of software, will the state protect their intellectual property? Or will a well-connected, politically powerful competitor just steal the code with absolute impunity because the judges are bought?
That is exactly the question it measures.
You know, looking at this data, a really stark realization hits me. Hard infrastructure, the dams, the highways, the power plants is actually the easy part of economic development.
It absolutely is.
If you have that 25.6% domestic savings rate we talked about at the very beginning, you can literally just buy a port. You can hire an international engineering conglomerate, hand them $1 billion, and they will pour the concrete and wire the grid. It just requires capital and a few years of construction.
But you cannot simply buy a culture of transparent civil service. You cannot import a fair, impartial judiciary. Soft infrastructure, clean politicians, predictable regulations, uncorrupted courts is incredibly difficult, agonizingly slow, and politically dangerous to build.
Because it threatens the people in charge.
Yes, it requires confronting and dismantling the power of entrenched elites who heavily benefit from the current corrupt system.
And this brings us to the core thesis of the entire data stack. This lack of soft infrastructure is the absolute essence of the middle income trap.
Let's connect all the threads here. Relying on massive amounts of cheap labor, moving people from farms to cities, copying existing Western technologies, pouring concrete. That strategy works. It takes a country from low-income poverty to middle-income stability.
But eventually, you hit a ceiling. Your labor is no longer the cheapest in the world.
Right, because there is always another country, slightly further behind, willing to sew the garments or answer the phones for half the price.
Precisely. So to cross that final, incredibly difficult threshold into high-income status, an economy cannot just manufacture other people's designs cheaper.
It requires endogenous innovation. It needs its own citizens to invent new technologies, create new efficiencies, and build global, high-value brands. And endogenous innovation is fundamentally impossible in a corrupt system with poor regulatory quality.
I mean, why would a brilliant engineer risk their life savings to start an innovative tech company if they know a corrupt regulator will just shake them down for bribes until they go bankrupt?
They wouldn't. They would either take their savings and dump it into unproductive, safe real estate, or they would take their brilliance and emigrate to a high-income country where the rule of law actually protects their work.
The brain drain.
Exactly. Corruption starves the local economy of the exact intellectual capital and innovation it desperately needs to break out of the middle-income trap.
So we have arrived at the strategic crossroad, page 15. The grand conclusion. Let's pull everything together into a final synthesis matrix. The researchers divided it into 4 quadrants: economic, health, environment, and institutions. It presents us with a ledger.
A very complex ledger.
On the positive side, the achievements of the LMCs over the last 40 years are staggering. Wealth has surged exponentially, pulling billions out of subsistence poverty. They have added 25 years to the average human lifespan. Basic illiteracy has been functionally wiped out. They are deeply, irreversibly woven into the fabric of the global economy.
It is, without exaggeration, the greatest period of poverty alleviation in the history of our species.
But on the negative side of the ledger, the challenges they face tomorrow are vastly more complex than the challenges they solved yesterday. Their healthcare systems are buckling under a tidal wave of expensive chronic diseases. Their economic engine is sputtering because cultural barriers keep half of their highly educated female workforce sitting at home.
And their physical environment is choked with soaring carbon emissions, pushing against global climate mandates.
Yeah. And tying it all down is the heavy anchor of lagging governance and persistent corruption. The playbook that got them to this point will not get them to the next level. They can't just throw more young bodies and more cheap coal at the problem anymore. The demographic dividend is aging, and the atmosphere is full.
They have to execute a pivot that is historically unprecedented in its complexity. They must transition to growth that is driven by high-tech innovation rather than raw manual labor, growth that is green and carbon neutral rather than fueled by fossil fuels,
Growth that is strictly and fairly governed by the rule of law.
and growth that achieves total gender equality in the workforce.
They essentially have to rewire the entire political, social, and economic contract of their nations, and they have to do it while the engine is still running at full speed.
It is a monumental task. But as the data shows, human ingenuity in these regions has already accomplished the impossible once.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you listening right now with a lingering, forward-looking question to mull over. We've talked extensively about the playbook LMCs used over the last 4 decades. It was a playbook that relied heavily on providing massive amounts of cheap, abundant human labor to a rapidly globalizing world that was hungry for exactly that.
It was the perfect match of supply and demand at the perfect historical moment, the golden era of globalization.
But look at the world we are stepping into today. We are entering a future where artificial intelligence, large language models, and advanced robotics might make cheap, repetitive human labor, whether that's assembling a phone in a factory or answering customer service emails in a call center, entirely obsolete.
A radical shift in the value of labor.
Yes. We are looking at a future where carbon emissions will likely carry strict, punitive global taxes, effectively cutting off the cheap energy pathway, and we are watching global free trade fracture into protectionist, localized regional blocs.
Right.
So the question is, how will the next generation of lower middle income countries climb the economic ladder? Or, when you look at the changing geopolitical and technological landscape, has the ladder itself just been pulled up?
That is the defining economic question of the 21st century.
We hope this deep dive has given you a new lens through which to view the global economy. The next time you see a headline about emerging markets or international trade, or even just check the Made in label on your electronics, we hope you see past the surface and understand the massive, incredibly complex human machinery working beneath the data. Keep questioning the numbers, keep looking for the why behind the what, and never accept a simple narrative. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you on the next one.